You think the Soviet Union was an unstoppable military juggernaut? In 1939, the mighty Red Army invaded tiny Finland, expecting an easy victory that would be over in weeks. Instead, they got their asses handed to them by Finnish farmers on skis. The Winter War became one of the most embarrassing military disasters in history, exposing Soviet weakness right before World War II and nearly getting the USSR kicked out of the League of Nations. What happened in the frozen forests of Finland will make you question everything you thought you knew about Soviet military power and strategic planning. Let's set the scene. It's November 1939. World War II has just started, with Germany invading Poland. The Soviet Union has signed the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact with Nazi Germany, secretly dividing Eastern Europe between them. Stalin's been busy grabbing territory, Eastern Poland, the Baltic states, and now he's looking at Finland. The Soviets want to move the border away from Leningrad and gain strategic territory. They demand Finland give up land near Leningrad and lease them a naval base. Finland refuses. Stalin decides to just take what he wants by force. The confidence in Moscow was absolutely absurd. Soviet military planners thought this would take 2 weeks, maybe 3 tops. They were going to march into Finland, the Finns would realize resistance was futile, and it would all be over by Christmas. The Soviet propaganda machine told citizens that the Red Army would liberate oppressed Finnish workers, who were supposedly desperate to join the Soviet Union. They printed maps showing Finland as part of the USSR before the invasion even started. They created a puppet Finnish communist government ready to take over once the Red Army rolled through. The math seemed to support Soviet confidence. The USSR had a population of 170 million. Finland had less than 4 million. The Red Army had thousands of tanks and aircraft. Finland had basically nothing by comparison. The Soviets could field over 1 million soldiers. Finland could barely scrape together 300,000 defenders, many of them reservists and older men. On paper, this was like a heavyweight boxer fighting a child. There was no way Finland could win. Except nobody told the Finns they were supposed to lose. The invasion started on November 30th, 1939. Soviet forces attacked along the entire border with overwhelming numbers. And immediately, everything went wrong. The first mistake was assuming this would be easy, which led to terrible planning. Soviet units weren't prepared for winter warfare, despite invading a northern country in winter. Soldiers wore regular uniforms, inadequate for temperatures dropping to minus 40 degrees. They didn't have proper winter equipment. Their vehicles weren't winterized. The entire logistical system was designed for a quick campaign, not extended operations in extreme cold. The Finns, meanwhile, were fighting on home territory in conditions they knew intimately. Finnish soldiers wore white winter camouflage and moved on skis through forests where Soviet vehicles couldn't follow. They knew every trail, every hill, every frozen lake, and they were absolutely furious that the Soviets had invaded their country. The combination of home terrain advantage, proper equipment, and sheer determination made the Finns far more effective than their numbers suggested. The Soviet military doctrine was another massive problem. The Red Army had just gone through Stalin's purges, which had killed or imprisoned most experienced officers. The remaining commanders were terrified to show initiative or make decisions without approval from above. Soviet tactics relied on overwhelming force and frontal assaults with minimal creativity. Attack directly, use superior numbers to crush resistance, repeat. This might have worked against a conventional enemy, but the Finns weren't fighting conventionally. Finnish defensive strategy was brilliant in its simplicity. They couldn't match Soviet numbers, so they didn't try. Instead, they used mobile defense, hitting Soviet columns, destroying supplies, then disappearing into the forest before Soviet forces could respond. Small Finnish ski units would attack at night, targeting officers and supply wagons, creating chaos and panic. Soviet soldiers started calling these Finnish raiders White Death and other terrifying nicknames. And speaking of White Death, let's talk about Simo Häyhä, possibly the most terrifying individual the Soviets faced during the entire war. This Finnish farmer-turned-sniper racked up over 505 confirmed kills in less than 100 days of combat. 505 Soviet soldiers killed by one man with a rifle. Häyhä used an old Finnish M2830 rifle with iron sights. No scope, because he knew scopes could fog up in extreme cold, and the glass could reflect light and give away his position. He packed snow in front of his position to prevent his muzzle blast from kicking up powder that would reveal his location. He kept snow in his mouth to prevent his breath from creating visible condensation in the freezing air. The Soviets became absolutely obsessed with killing Häyhä. They sent counter-sniper teams specifically to hunt him down. They called in artillery strikes on areas where they thought he might be hiding. Nothing worked. He'd take his shots and disappear, like a ghost in the White Forest. Soviet soldiers were terrified of him. The psychological impact of knowing that an invisible sniper might be watching you, that any moment could be your last, devastated morale. The Soviets finally hit him with an explosive round that tore off part of his jaw in March 1940, just days before the war ended. He survived, recovered, and lived until 2002, dying peacefully at age 96. One guy, 505 kills. The Soviets sent 1 million soldiers to Finland, and one Finnish farmer with a rifle became their worst nightmare. The most famous Finnish tactic was the moti, which means something like a bundle of firewood, but became the term for encircling and destroying Soviet units. Finnish forces would let Soviet columns advance deep into Finnish territory along roads through forests. Then they'd cut the road behind them, surrounding the Soviet units. The trapped Soviets couldn't maneuver off the roads because the snow was too deep and the forests too thick. They'd sit there while Finnish snipers and ski troops picked them apart. The Battle of Suomussalmi is the perfect example of Soviet strategic failure. 2 Soviet divisions, over 25,000 men with tanks and artillery, attacked along a road through the forest. Finnish forces, numbering only about 11,000, surrounded them and destroyed both divisions completely. The Soviets lost hundreds of tanks, thousands of soldiers killed or frozen to death, and massive amounts of equipment. The Finns captured so much Soviet gear that it significantly improved their supply situation. This wasn't supposed to be possible. A smaller force doesn't encircle and destroy a larger mechanized force. But the Finns did it anyway because Soviet planning and execution were that bad. The Soviet logistical failures were staggering. Supply lines stretched hundreds of miles through hostile territory and brutal weather. Soviet trucks broke down in the cold. Food froze solid. Ammunition supplies were inconsistent. Medical evacuation was nearly non-existent, meaning wounded soldiers often froze to death before receiving treatment. The Soviet military had grown accustomed to operating with overwhelming resources, so when things went wrong, they had no backup plans or flexibility. Soviet tanks, which should have been a decisive advantage, proved nearly useless in Finnish terrain. The forests and deep snow immobilized them. Finnish soldiers learned that Soviet tanks were vulnerable to Molotov cocktails, improvised incendiary devices that the Finns literally invented and named mockingly after the Soviet foreign minister. A guy on skis could approach a tank stuck on a forest road and disable it with a bottle of gasoline and a rag. The mighty Soviet armored force was being destroyed by farmers with homemade weapons. Soviet aircraft had similar problems. They had numerical superiority but couldn't effectively support ground operations. The thick forests made spotting Finnish troops nearly impossible, as the harsh weather limited flying time. Finnish anti-aircraft defenses, while limited, were effectively positioned. And the Finnish Air Force, despite having only a handful of obsolete planes, fought with such skill and determination that they achieved a remarkably positive kill ratio against the more numerous Soviets. The human cost of Soviet incompetence was horrific. Soldiers froze to death in their positions. Wounded men died because evacuation was impossible. Entire units were wiped out. Soviet casualties mounted into the hundreds of thousands, while the campaign that was supposed to take 2 weeks dragged into months. Stalin was furious. The Soviet propaganda machine had promised victory, and instead they were being humiliated by a tiny neighbor. The international response was devastating for Soviet prestige. The League of Nations expelled the USSR for aggression against Finland, one of the few times the League actually did anything. Western countries sent supplies and volunteers to Finland. The world watched the mighty Soviet military struggle against a vastly smaller opponent, and everyone drew conclusions about Soviet weakness. Hitler was watching too, and the pathetic Soviet performance convinced him that the Red Army could be defeated. The Winter War contributed directly to Hitler's decision to invade the Soviet Union in 1941. Stalin eventually committed overwhelming force and changed tactics. Instead of trying to advance through the forests, Soviet forces concentrated on breaking the Mannerheim Line, Finland's defensive fortifications on the Karelian Isthmus. With massive artillery bombardments and accepting enormous casualties, the Soviets eventually broke through. Finland, running out of ammunition and men, had no choice but to negotiate. The peace treaty signed in March 1940 gave the Soviet Union the territory they'd demanded originally, but at catastrophic cost. Soviet casualties were somewhere between 125,000 and 300,000 killed, depending on which source you believe. The Soviets admitted to 127,000 dead, but Finnish and Western estimates suggest the real number was far higher. Wounded numbered in the hundreds of thousands more. Finland lost about 25,000 killed. A terrible toll for a small nation, but a remarkable achievement considering they'd faced an enemy with overwhelming numerical superiority. But the real cost to the Soviet Union wasn't just the casualties. It was the strategic implications of exposed military weakness. The Red Army's reputation as an unstoppable force was shattered. Soviet tactical doctrine was proven outdated and inflexible. The officer corps, already gutted by Stalin's purges, was shown to be incompetent. Soviet equipment and logistics were revealed as inadequate for modern warfare. Every potential enemy now knew the Soviet military could be beaten. The Winter War directly influenced Nazi Germany's decision to launch Operation Barbarossa. Hitler and his generals looked at Soviet performance in Finland and concluded that the Red Army was weak, poorly led, and could be defeated quickly. They weren't entirely wrong based on the evidence. The Soviet military was weak and poorly led in 1939 to 1940. What Hitler didn't account for was that the Soviets would learn from their mistakes, that they had vast reserves of manpower and resources, and that invading the Soviet Union was a different proposition than invading Finland. Stalin knew the Winter War had been a disaster. The Soviet military underwent significant reforms after Finland. Commanders were given more authority to make tactical decisions. Winter warfare training was implemented. Equipment and logistics were improved. The officer corps was partially rebuilt, even releasing some purged officers from prison to serve again. These reforms helped the Soviet military perform better when Germany invaded in 1941. Though the initial stages of that war were still catastrophic. The strategic failure of the Winter War had multiple levels. First, the initial objective could have been achieved through negotiation. Finland was willing to make territorial concessions. They just wanted better terms than the Soviets initially offered. Stalin could have negotiated instead of invading and achieved similar results without the massive cost. Second, the military planning was incompetent from top to bottom. Attacking in winter without winter equipment, assuming easy victory without planning for resistance, using tactics unsuited to the terrain, failing to support troops logistically. Every aspect of the campaign showed poor strategic thinking. Third, the propaganda victory Stalin wanted turned into a propaganda disaster. Instead of demonstrating Soviet strength, the war exposed Soviet weakness. Instead of intimidating potential enemies, it encouraged them. Instead of showing the Red Army as an efficient modern force, it revealed an inflexible, poorly led military with inadequate equipment and terrible logistics. The reputational damage was enormous and had consequences that lasted years. Fourth, the war strained Soviet resources right before they needed them for World War II. The casualties, equipment losses, and economic cost of the Finnish campaign depleted Soviet strength just before the largest war in history. If those resources had been preserved, the Soviet Union would have been better prepared for the German invasion in 1941. Instead, Stalin wasted them on a campaign that achieved minimal strategic gain at maximum cost. The Winter War also damaged Soviet relations with potential allies. The Western democracies were already suspicious of Stalin after the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact with Hitler. The invasion of Finland confirmed those suspicions. Britain and France actually considered declaring war on the Soviet Union and sending military forces to support Finland. The plan fell through, but the fact that it was seriously discussed shows how much the invasion damaged Soviet international standing. When Germany invaded the USSR in 1941, Western countries were less enthusiastic about helping the Soviets partially because of lingering resentment over Finland. The human cost of Stalin's strategic failure extended beyond casualties. Soviet soldiers who survived returned home traumatized by the experience. Many had seen their units destroyed, their friends killed, and experienced the terror of fighting an enemy they couldn't see in conditions they weren't prepared for. The psychological impact on the Red Army was significant. Morale problems persisted for years. The Winter War proved to Soviet soldiers that their leadership would send them into disasters without proper preparation or support. Finnish society was also deeply affected, though in different ways. The successful defense created a strong sense of national identity and pride. The sisu, Finnish concept of stoic determination and resilience, became a defining national characteristic. But Finland also paid a heavy price. 25,000 dead in a nation of less than 4 million meant nearly every family lost someone. The territorial losses were painful, and Finland knew the Soviets could come back any time with even greater force. The strategic situation Finland faced after the Winter War was precarious. They'd won a moral victory, but lost territory. The Soviets remained a threatening neighbor with unfinished business. When Germany invaded the Soviet Union in 1941, Finland joined the German side, not because they loved the Nazis, but because they saw an opportunity to regain lost territory and protect themselves from Soviet aggression. This decision led to the Continuation War, which lasted until 1944 and brought more death and destruction. The Winter War's consequences rippled through Finnish history for decades. For the Soviet Union, the lessons of the Winter War were partially learned, but not fully implemented before the German invasion. Yes, they reformed the military and improved winter warfare capabilities. Yes, they replaced some incompetent commanders. Yes, they updated tactics and equipment, but the fundamental problems remained. The officer corps was still depleted from purges. Stalin still made strategic decisions based on political considerations rather than military reality. The logistical system was still inadequate. When Germany invaded in 1941, many of the same problems that plagued the Finnish campaign reappeared. The really frustrating thing about the Winter War from a Soviet perspective is that it was completely avoidable. The strategic objectives could have been achieved through negotiation. The campaign could have been planned better with realistic assessments and proper preparation. The tactics could have been adapted to terrain and conditions. Soviet soldiers could have been properly equipped and supported. None of this required genius, just competent leadership and realistic planning. Instead, arrogance, poor intelligence, and Stalin's demand for quick results created a disaster. Modern military historians study the Winter War as a case study in strategic failure. The campaign had almost everything wrong: unrealistic objectives, poor intelligence, inadequate planning, terrible logistics, inappropriate tactics, incompetent leadership, and complete misunderstanding of the enemy and terrain. It's taught in military academies as an example of how not to conduct operations. The fact that the Soviet Union eventually achieved its minimal objectives doesn't change the fact that the campaign was a strategic disaster that cost far more than it gained. The Winter War also demonstrated something important about military effectiveness. Numbers and equipment aren't everything. The Soviets had overwhelming numerical and material superiority. They should have won easily and quickly. But poor leadership, bad tactics, inadequate preparation, and low morale turned superiority into vulnerability. The Finns, with inferior numbers and equipment, won tactical victories through better leadership, appropriate tactics, proper preparation, and high morale. The war proved that how you use military force matters more than how much force you have. The legacy of the Winter War affected Soviet strategic thinking throughout World War II and beyond. Soviet military leadership became more cautious about assuming easy victories. They developed better winter warfare capabilities. They improved ski troops and cold weather equipment. They learned to respect opponents and terrain. These lessons helped during the defense of Moscow in 1941, when winter conditions and determined resistance stopped the German advance. The Red Army that fought in 1941 to 1945 was significantly better than the Red Army that invaded Finland, partially because the Finnish disaster forced improvements. But the Winter War also reinforced some bad Soviet habits. Stalin continued making strategic decisions based on politics rather than military reality. The officer corps remained politicized and fearful of showing initiative. The emphasis on overwhelming force and accepting high casualties continued throughout the war. The Soviet military learned some lessons from Finland, but not all the lessons they should have learned. The Finnish perspective on the Winter War is complex. They lost territory and people, but maintained independence. They proved that determined resistance could succeed even against overwhelming odds. The war became a source of national pride and identity, but it also brought decades of careful navigation between East and West during the Cold War. Finland couldn't afford to antagonize the Soviet Union too much, because they knew the Red Army could come back anytime. This created a situation called Finlandization, where Finland maintained independence but carefully avoided angering the Soviets. So yeah, the Winter War was the biggest strategic failure of the USSR before World War II. Stalin invaded a neighbor expecting quick victory and got humiliated instead. The Red Army exposed its weaknesses to the world. Hitler got encouraged to invade the Soviet Union. Hundreds of thousands of Soviet soldiers died or were wounded for minimal territorial gain. The international reputation of the USSR was damaged, and all of this was completely avoidable through better planning, realistic assessment, and competent leadership. The Winter War proves that even superpowers can fail catastrophically when arrogance replaces strategy and propaganda replaces reality. The frozen forests of Finland became a graveyard for Soviet soldiers and Soviet prestige, a disaster that Stalin never fully recovered from, and that shaped Soviet military thinking for years to come.